Okay. Welcome everybody. My name is Annette Foley and I am the President of Adult Learning Australia. Welcome to our webinar, which is called The Power and Potential of Adult Learning and Education in Changing Times. It's going to be a great 90 minutes of webinar today, and I'll be your MC all the way through. Just a few things I'd like to start off with, which are a few little housekeeping things. And the first housekeeping request, please, is if you could keep your mics muted. So in the old days when it was face-to-face, we would ask you to turn off your mobiles, but now I'm asking you to mute your mics, which would be terrific. Yes, as I was saying, the structure of the webinar is 90 minutes long. And if you, as I introduce our guest speakers, if you would like, add a question in the chat box or comments along the way. I'd also encourage you to tweet this event out, and I'm going to ask you at the end of the event how you felt about it and whether you might think about us putting on some more. I would also like to thank Georgia, and Georgia is a person behind the scenes but is doing so much to make these webinars happen for ALA. She did a wonderful job on Tuesday for those of you that were logged in and were listening to our launch. Georgia will also be helping me with questions because I'd have to say that I'm getting used to the idea of doing these online webinars, and sometimes some of the questions roll in very quickly. So the two of us will do that or share that role together. Now, I'd like to begin with the acknowledgement of country. Adult Learning Australia acknowledges the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and their continuing connection to land, waters and community. We pay our respects to First Nations people, their elders past, present and emerging. ALA recognises the unique place in Australian history and society of First Nations people and supports the adoption of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. So welcome all. I'm pretty excited today and actually quite thrilled to introduce to you our first keynote speaker, who is Professor Tony Dreyes. Tony is a nationally and internationally recognised academic and First Nations leader in policy, evaluation and research in the field of education. Tony is currently the Director, a Centre for Aboriginal Economic Policy and Research at ANU. So I'd like to welcome Tony. Thank you.
Annette, thank you. And good morning, Yama, to everyone who's joining the webinar today. I'm just going to pull up some slides, so bear with me. Okay, today, well, this week we're talking about changing times, and we're talking about lifelong learning in the context of changing times. And one of the themes of lifelong learning work has been this idea of renewal. I would like to look at this from the perspective of not only us being in changing times, but indeed turbulent times. I join Annette in acknowledging country, and one of the things that's been a result of these Zoom days is that we often have to acknowledge countries. And I join you this morning from Turrbal country, and I should imagine there are participants right across First Nations, right across Australia. So I acknowledge the country that you are sitting on, and I acknowledge the country that I not only sit on but reside my mob of Gamilaroi and Ualii people from northwest New South Wales and southwest Queensland. So I'm actually a visitor to the country I live. That's a beautiful nation. I pay my respect and those yet to come. Start with this. It's a rather provocative question. How would you describe 2020? Well, I suggest it's certainly not the year that we perhaps envisaged. 2020 vision, of course, has connotations of clarity, of foresight, of seeing things clearly. And yet the year has turned out to be probably the exact opposite. In fact, to put a technical and academic term to the year in my mind, it would be this. It's been a pretty shitty year. So what are we dealing with? Well, we've had front the start of the year and the end of last year with bushfires. And that's had a tremendous impact not only on natural environments and built environments, but indeed cultural environments, with the destruction of many a sacred site, along with the destruction of nature and, of course, people's homes, livelihoods and lives. We've also seen in 2020, triggered in the United States, but certainly a reminder of decades-long fight in this country that Black Lives Matter, and the disproportionate overrepresentation of our people in both juvenile justice centres and adult jails remains a national tragedy. More of our men go to jail than university. And then, of course, COVID and the many troubling implications, ramifications. So what can we learn from these times? From the perspective of bushfires, we can look at ancient cultural practices. And fire management always sat in a wider system of knowledge around caring for country, including the ability to be mobile on country and allow country to renew and sustain itself. What can we learn about Black Lives Matter? Well, we can learn about justice reinvestment models, such as in Burke in New South Wales. We're reminded of the ongoing challenge of equity and equality in this country. We've got the grand unfinished business of building social capital in this country by defeating racism to start with. COVID, what does it teach us? Well, we need to be better prepared for the next time. Unquestionably, there'll be a next time. It won't be called COVID-19, but pandemics. That's something that will continue into our future. We learned through COVID it wasn't all bad. With COVID taking hold across the world, we've seen pollution in big cities reduce. We've seen that reduce because there's been a disruption, some of it positive, to the changing nature of our work and life, including the fact that we don't need to be in the office every day. I want to particularly acknowledge people in Melbourne. I know you guys are doing it tough. And I apologise as a Queenslander for even stealing the AFL Grand Final from you. So what are the big takeout messages from these turbulent times in 2020? Well, to my way of thinking, a reminder about the importance, the fundamental importance of investment in human capital through both lifelong and life-wide learning. and that an informed citizenry is our best armoury, to my way of thinking. Now, ALA has adopted a rather funky renew you in terms of the theme. And I think that's a tremendous theme, because it goes to the idea that we can be constantly changing through learning experiences. We can renew ourselves, we can re-energise ourselves. But equally, running parallel with the concepts of renewal, I'd like us to think about new. You know, almost in the Lincoln kind of, Lincoln being a leader at a time of tremendous turbulence, civil war in the United States. And he once said, we need to disenthrall and start anew. And other thinkers, whether it's Lauren DeStefano, a writer, a young American writer, set fire to the broken pieces, start anew. Georgia O'Keeffe, an artist, I decided to start anew, to strip away what I had been taught. So what I'm arguing in these turbulent times is it's perhaps not just a question of renewal and rebuilding what we once had, but starting anew. We are undoubtedly experiencing gales of change. And to my way of thinking, the strongest bedrocks that we can adopt as a society and international, both domestic and international societies, are the bedrocks of learning. I want to now switch gear a little. I want to look at the perspective of COVID from a First Nations worldview, particularly as it relates to employment and income, which of course has natural associations with learning. And I want to share some data. We know that pre-COVID employment, when we look at outcomes for Indigenous men and Indigenous women, far behind non-Indigenous, particularly for Indigenous women, with an employment participation rate at just 40, tad over 40%. We know that in pre-COVID employment, there's been steady employment growth amongst First Nations people, partly driven by CDEP expansion until 2002, when it was abandoned by the Howard government. Since 2008, Indigenous mainstream employment has been flat. And with the abolition of CDEP from 2008, there's been a big impact on employment, particularly in remote areas and particularly among men. Indigenous male and female employment rates are slowly converging, but to a very low level. We know that the risks to Indigenous people and their employment in COVID times is likely to compound, because prior to COVID, Indigenous people sit in vulnerable groups where it comes to labour market. First of all, casualisation. And you can see rates amongst Indigenous men and Indigenous women far higher than their counterparts. Casualisation. We also know that temporary employment, which is another risk area, you know, last on, first off in terms of workplace participation. We know that Indigenous workers have been far more likely to be temporary or on fixed term, which makes them particularly vulnerable in COVID times. We also know that Indigenous workers were far more likely to be wanting more hours of work. So the rate of underemployment is far greater, as you can see there. You know, more than double in one case, in the case of men, 3 times, and women almost 3 times higher in terms of underemployment. We know when it comes to income and looking at poverty, Indigenous poverty rates were much higher pre-COVID and were growing in remote areas while falling in urban areas. To say, falling. We know that households in a pre-COVID income sense, you can see there all Australians at about $1,000 or more, with Indigenous Australians half that. And the fact that Indigenous women still live in lower income households, even compared to Indigenous. So what have been the early impacts of COVID on First Nations Australia? Well, the good news is, when you compare us internationally, let's take the First Nations, significant First Nations country in the United States. I particularly go to Arizona, which is the map on the right. Arizona being home to the Navajo people. Australia's been fortunate in a First Nation sense that we've been able to contain particularly remote communities. And it's somewhat ironic that, you know, the unenlightened, e.g. Abbott, talked about lifestyle choices of remote communities, when in fact here in COVID, remote communities and outstations provided the very harbour that people have required in terms of minimising risk to. You contrast that to Arizona and other parts of the United States where, you know, there's been this almost zeal, a very unhealthy zeal to let the economy rip and therefore open everything up. And in the case of Arizona, the result for First Nations people there has been an 18% of COVID-19 deaths among were Indigenous people, when they only account for 4.5% of the population. Let's come back home to Australia and see what the early kind of impacts on Indigenous people have been in terms of COVID. Well, we can see that the take-up and the eligibility of the coronavirus supplement being significant, very, particularly in outer regional right through to very remote. This has been a good thing because data show that Indigenous people are now more likely to be able to afford food, and that expenditure on food and other essential items has actually increased because their income has increased. Let's go to short-term employment impacts. Among Indigenous workers, along with women, young people, and poorer households, they are more likely to be in industries most impacted by COVID-19. And I remind you of kind of like casualised temporary employment. So we're talking in this case, things such as hospitality, tourism, the arts industries. Look at the impact on First Nations arts through some parts of Australia, the almost disappearance of tourism. Let's go to young people. And both, when you look at recipients of youth allowance and the changes between February, let's call that, COVID started to raise its ugly head, particularly began raise it outside of China. You've seen between February and May of this year significant increases in the uptake of youth allowance and the eligibility of youth allowance. This means more young people are either unemployed or underemployed. And that goes for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, bearing in mind the starting point of First Nations young people. We also know from the data that there have been big increases for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous youth between February and May in terms of social security data. So, what does all this mean when we are confronted with these gales? What are the pillars or bedrocks that we adopt? My thinking here isn't new thinking. I actually think we need a renewal of some of the principles that have been around for some time. And I particularly go to the Delors report to UNESCO back in 1996. And here we are in 2020, and I would suggest these pillars have never been more important. Learning to be, learning to know, learning to do, learning to live together. And there have been educationalists post these pillars who have been keen to add a fifth, namely learning to learn. But to my way of thinking, that's always been implicit in the Delors report. So what is the state of our pillars in Australia? How are they stacking up in Australia? I would argue that they're not anywhere near as strong as they ought to be. Some are stronger than others, I would argue. Learning to know, if you took the university system, notwithstanding its recent, the recent attacks on and unmet demand of risk to the university sector in Australia, the government that is unwilling to listen on. Still, when you look at international leagues tables, rate of GDP expenditure in areas such as learning to know, they're relatively strong. Learning to do, I've put that at the kind of visual that you see there as being lesser than learning to know, because, and I principally base this on the fact of the attacks on the TAFE system. And I would argue as an educator, the TAFE system was once a jewel in the crown of Australian education. And it's learning to be. This makes me think of the adult community education sector, the learning sector more broadly. Learning to be what? Learning to become, learning to belong. These are things that Australia seriously invests in. And finally, learning to live together. This is increasingly elusive. And you look at nations such as Great Britain, the torment it's been through in the last 2 years with Brexit. You look at the Trump years, and in this country, you look at the last decade and you ask yourself, are we improving in the area of learning to live together? Or are we seeing a serious diminishment of social capital in? So in conclusion, before I open it to questions, to my way of thinking, the only way forward is to rebuild these pillars, not only by renewing, but, and I made up a word here, unknowing. And unknowing is the area for creativity, lateral thinking, critical problem solving, and perhaps creating something that we haven't created. Thank you, and I will hand it back perhaps to Annette.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you so much. Thank you for the most thought-provoking presentation, incredibly stimulating. Yes, we have faced some, this is an extraordinary year with some extraordinary challenges and complex problems, and certainly it has brought up to the surface some of the issues across the country entirely. Some of the arguments that you've put forward are very, very important ones and stimulating for us to think about. And I know that I will continue to think about them well beyond today. So thank you for that. And I will now open it up for a few questions. And
if anyone has any questions, feel free to just pop them in the chat. We'll keep an eye on that.
Don't be shy.
No, don't be shy.
So
we have...
Sorry, go on, Annette.
Janine, I think, has asked, how can we improve our learning to live together? That's a simple one for you, Tony.
Well, we start very early. And we know that, particularly through influence of parents and others, that prejudice can creep in early. So you certainly invest early and reinforce with young people the kind of standards and ethics that are expected in terms of respect for your fellow human being, no matter what their creed, gender, etc. And we continue to reinforce that in schools. And I do see that. I do see that. I have great faith. Like I have teenage children, and they certainly come home and I hear what they're discussing in schools that we didn't. You know, when I was a kid, we only learn about Captain Cook. And that great achievement, we didn't hear about the great achievements of First Nation people. So it starts early. It's reinforced about amongst our young people. Then I would go to the issue of leadership. Now, you have a look at the United States and its current state of affairs. Monumental failure of leadership in terms of bringing black and white together. In fact, you've got a candidate with the upcoming presidential elections who has deliberately sought to drive that wedge between peoples in the hope of being re-elected. So leadership, incredibly important, and when it's not there, calling it out. Then there, of course, the importance of media. Hopefully through the advent of social media, we can continue, you know, it's a double-edged sword, social media, I recognise that. Be a real place, like a viper's nest of ugliness where it comes to racism, but it's also provided platforms, including the Black Lives Matters platform. It provides platforms for people to kind of counteract that. So, you know, pursuing media strategies is critically important as well. And then finally, I would add, you know, the little things. Saying to companies, for example, that advertise, you don't have to go just to the white male face all the time to sell a product. It's actually good for business if you can have your imagery reflect the diversity of Australia. And of course, we don't have that reflection of diversity. We don't have it in our parliaments yet. We don't have it on our screens yet. You know, my wife's an avid fan of Block. And she said, "Oh, come and watch this with me." And I said, "Oh, same thing every year, and it's always white fellas and you know, same sort of contestant. When are they going to start to reflect the diversity of Australia?" Coming back to the initial questions, there's some of the things I think that are important. Education, starting young, throughout life, leadership, and kind of media and reflecting the diversity of people and celebrating the fact that these tremendous achievements are made by people from all walks of life.
Thank you for that. There is one question that sums up a couple of other questions that have come up about the pillars, which I think are a fantastic use of an older example. I was very, very interested. I'll go back and have another look at that now that you've brought that up again. But Sam has asked, do you think any particular pillar is a priority right now as a catalyst for action with the others?
I would say living together. And I base that on not only the kind of the ongoing racial tensions that I speak about in societies, including our own, but I think COVID brings a whole new dimension about how we live together. At the moment, we're told to live apart, and how we, you know, for example, how do we ensure that we're not letting loneliness grow in these COVID times? Not only amongst our elderly, but I think particularly among people who may be experiencing mental illnesses and risk of that compounding when you don't have social interaction. For us as educators, it's a huge challenge. Are we going to keep putting our kind of teaching eggs in the Zoom basket? Or are there other ways we can go about a renewal and a renewal of learning? Here's a way out there kind of thought. Do we ask the ABC to create a fifth channel, and that's an educational channel?
Yeah, thought about that
for learning. So, you know, there's all sorts of things that we need to be thinking about. For example, the concept of when, you know, the vaccine comes and people are starting to move around again. Here's a visionary thought for you. Might Australia become the educational tourism capital of the world? And the fact that we can attach our we can kind of synthesize our tourism sector more with kind of learning experiences. You know, it's a question, and this is why in my presentation I talk not only about renewal, which says to me, when you look at the bushfires, and the kind of default lever amongst policymakers is, you know, something burns down or something an earthquake knocked something down, we'll just simply rebuild it the way it was. You know, in all cases, should we be doing that? Should we be putting houses back into areas where higher risk fire environments? Or do we think anew? I suppose I was making the difference between renew and anew. So to come back to the question, I think living together and really thinking about our social role in this country is critically important, and not only from the perspective of interracial or intercultural, but intergenerational. How do we connect young people with older people more? You know, geographically, how do we make sure remote communities don't become even more remote? And by that I don't mean remote communities just in a way out there kind of geographical sense. I know there are remote communities within cities. They're socially remote. They're economically remote. And often, one of the ugly aspects I saw in terms of developments in Melbourne was the stigma attached, for example, to some of the public housing precincts there. And I think that added to a psychology of remoteness, which is not a good thing for those people living there. So, Annette, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Tony. I think that there are certainly, if there's a positive with this, it does give us a chance to sit and reflect and think about how we might do things differently into the future. And I can certainly hear that resonating in what you're saying, and agree with that wholeheartedly. I could listen to you, and I'm sure all of us could listen to you for a lot longer, and we have a lot of questions that we've not gone through, but I think you've been able to capture those in your answers, and I thank you for that. I would like us to give you a virtual applause and thank you again for your generosity of time. So thank you very much. I'll just, on behalf of everybody, thank you once again. All right, so the next part of our webinar is we have 3 terrific panel members that are sitting back waiting for me to introduce them. What I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce the panel members to you now and give you some background on each. And then I'll introduce each one individually to speak to you. Normally we would do this as a panel together, but we're doing this more creatively online. So we have our first panel member is Josephine Boffa, and Josephine is a Community Partnerships Coordinator for Jesuit Community College, a program of Jesuit social services. We have next Luke Treadwell, and Luke is a senior teacher with many years of program and project management experience at the Adult Multicultural Education Services, AIMS. Welcome, Luke. And we also have our third panel member is Professor Sue Shaw. And Dr. Shaw is currently an adjunct professor with Charles Darwin University, having spent her previous time there as Professor of Education Research and the inaugural Director of the International Graduate Centre of Education between 2014 and 2018. So I'd like to thank all 3 panel members for agreeing to be involved with speaking to us and providing to us their reflections from their sector and speak on their understanding of the observed changes and positive stories of how learning has transformed the lives of the people they work with. They're also going to give you an example or a case study of that, and each panel member will speak to us for 8 minutes, and then of course we'll have the opportunity after that to ask and answer some questions of them. So I'd like to welcome and thank Josephine Boffa. So thank you, Josephine.
Thank you, Annette. Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting the Jesuit Community College to be a part of this panel this morning. And thank you to everyone who is in attendance. So what I'm going to talk about in the next 8 minutes is I'm going to look at the positive stories, some positive reflections of our experience working with adult learners. And in particular, I want to focus my discussion on our experience in working with adult learners who are involved in the justice system, and how we've been able to reach and engage those adult learners, looking at the vehicles and the tools we've been able to use, and also, more importantly, the positive outcomes and how transformative their experiences of adult learning has been. As we know that the data suggests that for a lot of people involved in the justice system, they have very low educational attainment. So a lot of them have had interrupted education or very negative experiences of education for a range of reasons. So what we've been able to do to reach and engage this cohort of learners is we've been able to embed training within their context of their community work. So for a lot of these learners, well, for all of these learners, the magistrate has mandated that they need to do community work, and that could be in a range of activities from gardening work. It could be around cleaning up, landscaping, or it could be, sometimes it can be some very mundane work like knitting and unpicking labels off shirts. So what we've been able to do is embed training into that setting, into that context. So through the use of pre-accredited training, the ACFI funding has been a wonderful vehicle whereby we can engage learners in training while they are doing their community work. Now, the wonderful thing about the pre-accredited training is it's very flexible, and so it allows us to tailor the programs to suit the learners, and it can also mean that we can deliver things in a creative way. So as you can see here, how we've been able to reach and engage a group of learners who otherwise would not engage in education. For a lot of them, it's not forefront in their minds. They have many other challenges and barriers to training, and one of them is time. They may have a lot of community work hours to engage in, or they just haven't had positive experiences in training or school, and they're just not motivated really to go back to study. So we've been able to reach and engage these learners by embedding training into their community work. And this is where the transformation has occurred. And I'd like to call it learning by stealth. Often they're not really aware that they are learning until the program finishes. And there's a quote there that one of our participants in one of the programs, when she knew that there was education or training embedded in her community work, which happened to be a knitting program, she said, "I hated the whole idea of education being introduced into our knitting program." So just to give you an idea of the range of programs we've been able to deliver and how we've been able to engage learners, we've been able to deliver vocational courses. That's been mostly around garden and landscaping and horticulture. And through that, we've been able to build participant skills and knowledge for further training in horticulture, landscaping, permaculture. Other programs we've been able to embed is employment skills, where we're really, if you just want to pause there, where we've been able to build people's employability. And then we've had more creative programs, and I'd like to say they're more program-based, where the learners have been working together to achieve a common outcome. And that might be through a knitting program, it might be through producing an art program, a calendar, a set of cards. So that's the vehicle and the tools that we've been able to use to engage these learners. So the best way really to evidence the success or the transformative nature is, as we know, we evaluate all our programs, and these quotes here are from a group, are from the adult learners in the justice system who, for a lot of people, were resistant to training. They had very negative models of school and education, and the power and the potential of the adult learning has not only changed their view of themselves, it's brought learning into their consciousness, and they're starting now to, as I say, we've kind of scrambled their brains about their views of themselves and their views of education. So as you can see here, these are some quotes from a range of adult learners who were doing the garden program in the justice system, and these are the positive comments that have come out of that program. And as you can see, a lot of them are about not only what they've gained from the program, but the transformative nature of how they've felt about themselves, how they can take their learning out of the context of the program and apply it in their everyday life. And we all know that, you know, real learning occurs when you can apply it in a least familiar context. And I think if you look at that last quote, the program gives me a sense of satisfaction. I'm getting to socialise, and socialising has been one of my downfalls. So, you know, this just evidences the power and the transformative nature of adult learning for a group who thought going back to school or doing any study was beyond them or something they didn't even think was in their consciousness. So, Georgie, do you want to just flip the next slide? If that you can, if that's okay if you can't. There's another, okay. So this is another program where we were looking specifically at really looking at people's own individual skills and qualities. For a lot of people in the justice system, they haven't worked. As I said, they've had poor educational attainment, and a lot of them don't actually see that they do have personal strengths. They do have skills, and they do have qualities that are transferable to the workplace, but they just don't see what they are and how we can package them up in an employment context. So this particular program was really about identifying people's individual strengths, all their knowledge and the skills that they have attained throughout their lives outside of the traditional work setting and education setting, and how they can understand themselves better, and that they do have a lot to offer. So this program was really about looking at, as adults, we all have skills, we've all learnt in other contexts outside of school, and this program was really much about the learners reflecting on their own skills and strengths and how they can use those for further study or how they are very valuable for employability. And these are some really positive comments that came out of the course for people. And it's really starting, like one of the quote there says, I'm exploring my career and expanding my options. So it's really about focusing the people towards opportunities, whereas before it was more about excuses and, you know, using the strengths and ability that I've gathered about myself. So once again, this shows how powerful adult learning is, because we all have strengths, we all have stories, we all have experiences. And for a lot of people in the justice system, they, you know, things are being done to them, not with them. And I think, you know, for them to be very honest about themselves, and here we can see the power of adult learning and just empathising with people and maybe looking at people through a different lens. Thanks, Georgia. We can have the next one. This is probably... So I'd like to really finish with how the transformation of adult learning not only changes the lives of the adult concerned, but by extension, individuals and their families. Now, this quote at the top, hated the whole idea of introducing education into our knitting program. This was a female participant. She was been involved in the justice system for quite a while. She was engaged in a knitting program, and in that program we embedded language literacy and numeracy training. And here's some of her quotes of how, at the end of the program, how transformative she felt it was. And I think in particular, if we look at the second quote, I'm confident for the very first time ever to help my children with their homework. And as you can see, for someone who hated the whole idea of education, after being introduced to the language and literacy program in her community work, she then went on to enrol in a Certificate 2 in Animal Studies. And she travelled from Mornington to Brunswick. And I think that clearly evidences the transformative nature and how powerful it is. But what I'd really like to finish with, I'd really like to read out to you the rest of this participant's comments about how transformative her experience of adult learning were. So it won't take me long, it's only a couple of minutes. So this is the participant's voice. As you know, I never finished school. I hated classes when I was a kid, so why would I want to do any more training as a grown-up? But now I've learnt new things. I love the start of class and how you do check your baggage and you do all the reflections at the end of the day. I'm keeping a gratitude journal as well as taking time at the end of each day to ask myself and my kids, what were your positives, your apples, and what were the negatives, the onions? I get the kids to do this at the dinner table too, so it's become a way that we have started to talk more positively to each other. You made maths fun, and I actually love doing all those increase your vocabulary exercises. I'm now confident for the first time ever to help my children with their homework. Tell the funding people that. It's great, isn't it? Hopefully they will get to understand that this is the biggest thing that has been given to me. I don't feel like an idiot anymore. And I'm able to help my children with their maths and English homework. And I know that they are so happy that I'm able to help them. I don't feel stupid, and I don't feel like they think that my children think I am stupid. The best feeling is being respected by my children and feeling useful and making them happy, all rolled together. It's so good. I'm leaving the program and I'm very grateful for you having the faith in me and being given the opportunity to go back to school. And also it's made a change in me, and now I'm able to help myself and my family. But I have now become the 3 things that I had long ago given up on: being a good mother, a good student, and a good person. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Josephine. Thank you very much. That was very heartfelt and fantastic presentation. I'd now like to ask Luke to present to us. Thank you.
Thanks, Annette. I'm just going to share my screen. Good morning, everyone. I'm a teacher at AIMS, and we teach foundation skills, English as an additional language courses to both recently arrived and long-term migrants and refugees. And I just wanted to talk about a change in both my learning practice and I guess the learning methodology our organisation has adopted over the last couple of years. And I think this change has been validated and accelerated by COVID, which I'll touch on as we go. There. So from mid-2017, AIMS has progressively adopted a blended learning methodology in our delivery of our English as an additional language programs. And essentially that means that 60% of all of our all of our delivery's been face-to-face, and 40%'s been online. I guess I just need to describe our learning cohort for you. 2/3 of our learners are people with very limited English language skill. They typically come from a refugee background, and they have typically had interrupted and sometimes no formal education in their countries of origin. Next slide. So I'll just show you what our blended learning delivery model looked like pre-COVID. We had 3 hours of face-to-face classroom delivery. We then had 1 hour of online training that was facilitated by the teacher. And then we had 1 hour of independent learning where the student engaged independently, either on site in our independent learning centre or remotely at home, at their home or in a library. And that hour could be done really at any time of the student's choosing. So why did we adopt this model? Well, we've recognised that digital literacies as a generic skill set is increasingly required in education institutions, workplaces, job search and community. And I was thinking this is even more true considering some of those changes and opportunities that Tony described that COVID has brought about. So what we want to do is support our students to develop basic IT skills to access digital devices and platforms, to improve their English language skills, of course. And I think this one is a really key one. We also want to support the students develop self-direction and increasing independence as learners in the learner-centred education environments that we have here in Australia. And finally, again, a very critical one is around digital citizenship. And I guess what COVID has exposed here in Melbourne is, I guess, many of the gaps and shortcomings that different groups have in our community in terms to access to information and access to technology and access to opportunity. I'm thinking specifically who got to keep their job and who has to stay home. So I just wanted to give you a bit of a look at what our online learning looks like. We use Moodle, and we've developed our courses, as I said, that allow the students to engage in their learning at a time and a place that best suits them, at a pace that is right for them. And critically, it allows them to check and correct their responses and repeat activities as they choose. So what I've got on the screen here is just a very simple online activity for our, I guess, our lowest level learners. And as I hope you can see, students are able to listen to, in this case, of very simple vocabulary, have the opportunity to read it, they have the opportunity to listen and repeat, to practice their spoken skills. And this will move on to some other activities where they'll get to use this vocabulary in a variety of ways. But again, at the same time, they're building not only their skills to be able to use digital technology, but their confidence. And they're in charge of their learning. And I think this is a real advantage of this approach we've adopted. And I just thought I'd share a couple of anecdotes to illustrate this. So I had in my class a very gregarious woman from the Horn of Africa. She had good spoken English skills, but her need was around developing her writing. And she really struggled with that for some time, but we went into the hard lockdown, as everybody knows, and we haven't delivered face-to-face teaching since March. And I was just having a conversation with this student a couple of weeks ago, and I was giving her the feedback that her writing's improved dramatically. And she said, yes, I haven't enjoyed being away from the classroom, but what I've learned is that while I was in the classroom, I was counting on you to do, I guess, the learning for me. You're my teacher, you know, you have to do something. But at home, I realized, actually, this is my responsibility. I've got to do the work. And I'm very happy to report she did do the work. And her writing has improved, you know, quite significantly as a result. I'll just show you another one of our Moodle activities. This is a slightly higher activity, but again, I just use it as a way of illustrating what we're providing our students, and they can complete the activity, they can check their work, they can correct their work, they can repeat their work, and they can do it at a time and a place of their choosing. We feel equipping our students with these skills has allowed us to, I guess, meet the challenge that COVID's posed. So this graph reflects just the total number of hours of online learning our students do. And as you can see, in 2020, by both necessity and I think a success, we have had quite a significant increase in the number of online hours our students have independently accessed and completed. And finally, I just wanted to show you this data because it's I guess reveals some, I think, very interesting trends that COVID has both necessitated and accelerated. We have seen a doubling from pre-COVID numbers of students accessing online learning on their mobile phones. And as you can see, pre-COVID this year, students were doing their online learning for a total of 770 hours. And since we've gone into the COVID restrictions, that's dramatically increased to 4,973 hours. And I just want to share with you another anecdote that I think kind of really nicely illustrates some of the advantages of our online learning approach. I work with predominantly a group of refugee women from Afghanistan, Syria, and Sudan. And I had a woman, one of my women learners, tell me last week that she has become very confident on her mobile phone, and what that has allowed her to do is to communicate and connect with her family back in Afghanistan without needing to go to her primary school children and ask for help. And she said, for the first time I've been in Australia, which has been about 5 years, I'm starting to feel in control of my life. And that's, I think, the point I want to make, is that I think, as well as being a very effective way of preparing our adult refugee and migrant learners for all aspects of life in Australia, this is a very effective way of helping them develop their English skills, their confidence, and that sense of control. So thank you.
Thank you, Luke. Thank you so much. It was very inspirational, and again, I think example of how the COVID situation can provide some opportunities for learners. Thank you very much. And our final panelist today is Professor Sue Shaw. Thank you, Sue.
Hi, thanks, Annette. Thanks for asking me along to talk this morning about some of my reflections on being involved in adult education and learning. And I realise it's about 40 years. It just seems like an incredibly long time. So I'm sitting here in Darwin on Larrakia country. I want to pay my respects to Larrakia elders, past, present and emerging. And also recognise that an enormous amount of learning that I've been involved in over the last 40 years has come from colleagues and students, and also Kaurna elders in Adelaide and Aranda and other elders in Central Australia where I've worked. So I often describe my work as being up the centre of Australia, not focused around the East Coast or the Blue Mountains. I think a lot of my work has also been focused in the last 25 or 30 years on educating the educators. Now, what are the kinds of things that we need to talk to educators involved in adult learning, community education around Australia and internationally? And so, not surprisingly, many of the commonalities here in Australia also seem to be common for people involved in adult education overseas. And I see Robbie Guevara is on the list of chat people, and the work that he's been doing in the ASBAE Society is really important to connecting us in with developments overseas. I think I missed the memo about the case study, but I've thought of one that I'm going to talk about. But I'm also interested in the idea of optimism, and maybe I have a warped sense of optimism, but I'm hoping that some of the things that I'll talk about will help us think about what kind of future we might be moving into while keeping really mindful of the past. Many of us recognise adult education has always been a catch-all phrase, and particularly in the areas that I've worked in adult literacy. Adult literacy, adult education, they're anything, anywhere, anytime, anyhow, and just about anyone can do them. And particularly in literacy, there's always been the phrase that each one can teach one. And I think to a certain extent that's true. But I have always been interested in what is it that prompts us to be an effective, useful, good educator. And on the one hand, I think also adult education's always been bound up in skills and work focused, and a really well-intentioned and indeed legitimate focus on moving people into employment. Again, I've been reminded that for those of us who have lots of certificates and pieces of paper, we might be critical of them, but those pieces of qualifications can be incredibly important for people wanting to get their way into work. And I should say secure employment, not just employment and projects, one after the other, and casual work, but secure employment. But I think on the other hand, what's often ignored is just how long it takes to socially train young people into the ways of the world. A lot of us spend 7 years in primary school and 3 to 5 years in secondary school, at least. And we learn a lot more than maths and science along the way. We learn how we fit into hierarchies, politeness training. Some of us learn that better than others, I think. Sitting still, when to speak back, when not to, when it's clever not to raise your voice. And I think despite the changes in schooling, there's still a lot of these important lessons that we're teaching children today. So I want to talk today about some of the prior principles that have been embedded in adult learning and education when the organisation first started, and how some of those we might need to rethink and look at how they can help us deal with some of the challenges that are still relevant for these times. And I suppose the opportunities, but also the dangers, the perils associated with adult education's role in what is an important part of what I call social training. The second point, in light of the first, is that we've been through a lot of inquiries and reviews and evaluations undertaken over the last 60 years. And they remind us of this focus on social training. I don't think it's extreme, for me at least, to say that all of the government-driven inquiries and publicly driven inquiries can also be framed as part of a social war after Anne Stoller's research on what we might call enemies of the state. Some people have said that I'm a bit extreme in stating this, but there's a logic behind it that I think can be followed fairly easily. And these enemies of the state are the unemployed, the disabled, the bereaved, the poor, refugees, speakers of other languages than English. They're people who are often positioned as effectively incompetent unless they participate in a program which then gains them the status of a lifelong learner and a productive citizen who can contribute productively to the workings of the economic state. There's a lot of talk about citizenship and civil society and community education, but I think the focus of that in our adult education system and sector these days is really diminishing. After Ghassan Haj, I would talk about these inquiries as rituals of white empowerment. They're not really inquiries at all, but they have a way of recentering a particular type of agentic citizen who's going to be really useful for the state as an economic piece in the overall machinery. So I think over time, and as part of these inquiries, the sector overall and the various parts of it have been captured by the machinery of training. I'm not sure that this is new for many people. They feel as though they have been caught up in a machinery of training that reinforces a primary goal of being a productive working citizen. And again, work's important. We've seen in these times how important it is for people to maintain a sense of economic security, not just as an individual, but for their families and their friends and their extended relations. But this machinery that we're involved in of programs and curriculum and resources and funding all linked to this idea that an imaginary citizen can slip into a job. As I said, we've seen how quickly this can be destabilised in recent times. But we should also remind ourselves of the importance of history and how there are times past of that substantial unsettling in the way that people lived. Sitting here in Darwin, I'm reminded of the military intervention into remote living community, remote community living in the Northern Territory, and that wasn't so long ago. So I think one of the things that we're often missing in our time in adult education, and this is not a plug for nostalgic reflections about how good it was in the good old days, but I think we need to take seriously a request to have time to think about what the past can teach us and what the present and our possible futures are as adult educators and where we want to be as an adult education organisation in the future. In light of the decline, as Tony and I think someone else mentioned, in adult education programs around universities in the country, around the country, and combined with this cert for training minimum benchmark for many adult educators in RTOs, we don't have a lot of time to rethink anew, again, a word that Tony used earlier. I don't think universities are perfect. I think some of the work that we've done in the past in terms of training adult educators has been a bit appalling. But I think Garth Boomer, famous South Australian adult educator, claimed that well-intentioned educators can often be like misguided missiles. We need time to think, rethink and position where we're going in our practice and actually talk to each other. So I think this is relevant to Adult Learning Australia's metamorphosis as an adult education body and how we as an organisation work together in a sector that cannot possibly hope to adequately represent every single instance of people's needs as workers and citizens and community members and as individuals. The organisations that I've been involved in, Network of Women in Further Education, very old name for the now Women and Vocational Education Network, Avetra, a research-based focused organisation, many of the local church bodies and NGOs, and the Australian Council for Adult Literacy, all with slightly different but really important takes on what are we to do in this kind of world to support people. I think all of these organisations chip away at what's constantly presented as a default working life rather than a much broader life around community participation and engagement in civil society. And I think most recently I've been looking at a strong argument that's emerged over the past decade about the importance of what I call bubbies. Having recently become a grandmother, I suppose I'm talking a bit more about bubbies more often. But it seems to me that babies and young children are seen as a pure and unfettered way to kickstart the economic and social training that we need to make the future great again. And in this narrative, I think a lot of adults, particularly those of us who might be a little bit older, a little bit more wrinkly, a little bit more crusty and impatient, not so easy to talk to, not as polite as the young, lovely, clear-skinned bubbies of the world. It's a lot harder to work with people who will speak back to you. I think we've been going for a long time through a period of moral scorn directed at adults, people like single parents, and actually I think what the media means and politicians mean is single mothers, low-wage workers, older men and women who've fallen on hard times through no fault of their own. Babies have much more softening effects, I think, than those of us who are a little bit older and more impatient for particular kinds of change. So I think this moral scorn at people is out of proportion to what people can do to take responsibility for their lives. It's a kind of blame, identifying the victim and then blaming them for their lot in lives. That scorn is also directed, I think, to people living in remote communities. And let's be frank, remote, in the sense that I'm using it, means mostly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who make up 95% of people living in what's called a remote community often. And I think, as Tony had mentioned earlier, that positioning of people's need and decision to stay on country as a lifestyle choice, as one of our former Prime Ministers noted, is also a really default deficit that's been built into the kind of language that we've been working on today. So I'm just checking my time. So one of the challenges I think we have is to be really clear about how we interrupt the way words are used to gloss and generalise very distinct, specific issues in people's lives. I don't think that means we need, and I think we need to think carefully about ideas about hard work, endeavour, enterprise, leadership, entrepreneurial spirit, and productive work ethic are all part of the education and training enterprise over centuries. That's not to say that it's not good to work with people who are happy, enterprising, efficient, go-getters, but underneath that default image of a worker are some serious assumptions about what different kinds of cultures, what different diverse groups of people can bring to a workplace or a community. And I've come to think about a lot of this as the structures of feeling, what Raymond Williams calls the structures of feeling of education, built around values of respectability and hard work and participation that's premised on a mainstream norm. And I think we need to keep disrupting that mainstream norm of who is a productive worker and what other ways of working in this new world that we're in are we going to be exploring in the future. And I'm not saying employment is a redundant concept because I think we need to constantly find ways to reinvent the assumed discourse of employment pathways and profitability that are going to open up to people who've improved their literacy skills or their numeracy skills or their soft skills or indeed their digital skills because there are many other things that stop people from gaining work or gaining value and recognition in our society. So I suppose in seizing this particular moment, I'm hoping that we can be mindful about some of the things that we've done in the past as a sector and as advocates and activists, and keep thinking about how seizing one aspect of the moment might actually lead to consequences that we hadn't intended. We've already seen in these presentations how young women, how Indigenous people are losing out on employment opportunities through COVID. And I think as we move forward, we keep having to juggle and jostle how we're going to stay optimistic, as was the request, but bear in mind what things have been lost in the past by taking up particular pathways around education and training. I'll stop there, but happy to take questions. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Sue. That was very comprehensive, very interesting, and there were some synergies between that and the other presentations about seizing opportunities. We are running out of time, so I was going to ask the panel members a question about COVID, but I do believe that a lot of the presentations have really addressed where COVID sits and opportunities post-COVID. So what I might do is I'm going to ask each presenter one question from the audience. I will ask Josephine the first question, and I'll ask Georgia to find a couple of questions, one each for Luke and Sue, as Josephine is answering this question. And the question from the audience, Josephine, is, what processes do you see are important in helping your students transition from custody to education and from community education to further education or employment?
Yeah, I saw that, Ron. That's a great question. Look, I think the role of mentors is critical in that transition. Jesuit Social Services was commissioned by the Legal Services Board to do some research into people on community work orders in the West. And what was one of the really telling findings there was, for a lot of the people involved in the justice system, the lack of networks and isolation was a very critical characteristic that pervaded through quite a lot of the people in the justice system. So it's how to link them and how to navigate and how to assist them to access the programs that do help them in that continuum of learning, going from community education, then maybe to a mainstream setting, and then ultimately to employment. As we know, the state government has a lot of alternative education and employment programs, such as the Skills First Reconnect program, which is assisting people back into education. They have the Job Victoria Employment Network program, which is an alternative to the mainstream job active services. So I guess the programs are there, but you're right, it's a mentor, whether it's a pathway support, but they really need the help and the guidance, because they lack the social capital. They often don't know how to access these programs or where to go. There's a lot of isolation. So mentors, or whether it's a mentor or whether it's a paid position in the structure of the justice system or in the structure of community education providers, that there is someone that can guide these people to connect and access the mainstream service sector. Because for a lot of them, they're isolated, and that's why they are marginalised. So I think it's a role, it's a person, it's a mentor, rather than a program. That's a great question, and yeah, mentors critical. I hope that's.
Thank you so much. That was terrific. Thank you. The next question is for Luke, and I did see a
I've got a
question.
question for Luke, Annette, from the chat.
Yep.
So
Terrific.
it's from Ron, and he said, Digital Skills Planning Challenge. Are they standalone skills or integrated within learning content?
No, they're very much integrated. And I guess I'll give you just a simple example. So we have created this online learning platform for our students to be able to learn English. And the first, and what it proved to be very big challenge we faced was the whole concept of logging into something was something that they were completely unfamiliar with. 2/3 of our students come to us without an email, never having an email, and we had to spend a lot of time helping them just log in so they could learn English. And they do learn, they learn quite quickly how to log in, and learning that skill, in their mind, it's kind of incidental to getting onto the course to do their English study, means that they have that skill that now they can transfer to other critical parts of their lives. So now they can maybe log into MyGov to access their Centrelink benefits or their Medicare record or whatever it is. They can log into WhatsApp and Viber and talk to family and friends in their countries of origin. So all along the way, we have very clear expectations and very strong support to provide our students with that digital skills development in the context of learning English, learning about life in Australia, learning about participating fully as a citizen. And again, just quickly, that question of digital citizenship. We have some very simple forums where students are given the opportunity and are given the support to start to interact online. And I guess picking up on Tony said earlier about all that's good in social media and all that's bad. And here we're able to give our students that first experience that's heavily supported, that's heavily moderated, because we want them to be able to participate. And so they're practicing their English, they're writing their simple post. You know, my COVID week was this is how I feel, this is what I did. But they're also learning, practicing those digital literacy skills and getting that confidence.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that, Luke. And we do have a question for Sue there.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, the machinery of training, it's almost like it's never ending, ceaseless. I was thinking about a case study of a program that I've been involved in here at Charles Darwin University. So it's not quite answering the question that you've asked, but I'll try and get onto that quickly. We run a Masters of Education program here, which is designed to be not a fast track, but it's almost like a bridging and prep course for people who want to go into research and training, like a Masters by Research or a PhD. And what we find, I could have replaced Luke's words about his students with the same storyline about people coming in to that program. They're not used to certain things, but once they get in the program and they talk with other educators who come from a wide range of sectors and a wide range of education purposes, they start to develop a confidence and a language for talking about how they're going to advocate on behalf of people in their area. Now, those languages are quite diverse and quite different. If you're advocating for government, with government and to government, knowing the language of government and how it works is actually really critical. Like knowing how policy works and what policy cycles are really important. I'm reminded in the 1990s of the adult literacy movement that said, I think it was Larry Carmichael, Laurie Carmichael, well-known union advocate, who said that award restructuring can't happen without adult literacy. And I'm always going back to that moment thinking, that's true, but was that the best hook for us to hang our advocacy hat on? It was a really important hook to be part of. But the machinery of award restructuring picked up many adult literacy researchers and educators and learners, and it just picked them up and put it into the machinery of cogs to think about how literacy could fit in. Now, many other projects were involved in saying that literacy couldn't be just bolted on, it needed to be built in. So I think we need to have a lot of different ways in which people learn the language, not only of advocacy, but also of activism, of speaking back, and sometimes telling government, this isn't working. You know, sometimes we're a bit too polite, and we need, I think, to say, there are elements of this policy that are working, but this one is seriously wrong. I'll have a look at the other questions.
I think that's all we can really manage. We're actually running out of time. So thank you so much, Sue. And I love and think it's incredibly important for all of us to consider activism in our roles, and particularly researchers in the area. I now would like to thank all of the panel members once again, and introduce to you Dr. Trace Ollis, who is a senior lecturer in adult vocational applied learning at Deakin University. She's a principal editor of the Adult Journal, the Australian Journal of Adult Learning, which is our journal. And Trace is going to launch the ACE scan. So thanks, Trace.
Well, thank you, Annette, and everyone. Can you hear me? I hope you can hear me. It's wonderful to be here today, and especially to hear some of the wonderful case studies and also the fabulous speakers that ALA has brought to us today. I love Adult Learners Week, and I just think it's such a great celebration of adult learning. I think the theme of Renew You really reflects the promise of adult learning, that we continue to learn for the whole of our lives, renewing and rebuilding our understanding of ourselves and the world around us as adults. Adult Learners Week, of course, celebrates the joys of learning for personal interest, to reskill and retrain, to stay socially connected as we age. Adult community education in Australia provides formal, informal and incidental learning across a lifetime in local community settings. In doing this, it also fosters new friendships and social connections, connecting communities, decreasing social isolation, and also increasing knowledge of civics and local community politics. It also provides opportunities for volunteer work with a local ACE provider, and for reskilling and retraining for jobs, which enables economic security for individuals and families. And I think we've heard some fantastic case studies today of adult learning across a number of contexts. My task today is to launch the ACE Scan 2020. The ACE Scan tracks 15 years of data, and Jenny tells me there's some recent NCV data that will also be updated in this current scan soon too. ACE is a recognisable education sector that offers accessible lifelong learning opportunities that are learner-centred and needs-based. This ACE scan builds on the work completed in Adult Learning Australia's previous ACE scans. This update was completed by Catherine Devlin, but the original report has always been produced by Adult Learning Australia, and its former contributors, Deb Parker, Sally Brennan and Trish Curtis and Kay Bauman. What the ACE scan does is it provides data that shows the breadth and depth of the ACE sector, and it gives insight into the work of neighbourhood houses, men's sheds, universities of third age, learn locals, community colleges, just to name a few organisations within the scope of ACE. It brings together a range of complex data sources that provide a comprehensive overview of adult learning that occurs in this space. The diversity of the ACE sector in all its complexity, renowned for its inclusive practices and working with learners who have frequently been alienated from a neoliberal system of education that ranks, assesses and categorises learners according to their abilities. In launching this ACE scan, I'd like to note that it covers 4 key areas: personal enrichment, informal and non-formal learning activities, adult basic education, non-formal and formal, formal VET training, and pathways from one type of learning program to another. I want to also note that in the McKenzie report 2015, which investigated the impact of privatisation on VET, it noted, in contrast to VET, the ACE sector's capacity to be flexible and nimble in its provision of adult learning programs. And this is important recognition because in the current COVID environment, whilst the pandemic has been happening across Australia and particularly in Victoria, neighbourhood houses and other ACE providers, for example, have been at the centre of providing not only adult education to communities, but also providing emergency relief, support and care services since the advent of the pandemic. So, in launching this ACE scan, I want to express the importance of having access to this complex data that really provides an overview of the ACE sector. I want to congratulate Adult Learning Australia for championing this ACE scan over many years. It fills a gap in a lack of national coordination of data of ACE reported by state and federal governments. I know that Jenny will provide a link for all of you that want to access the document, but I also want to say that it's published in the current edition of the Australian Journal of Adult Learning as a non-refereed article. That's a shameless plug, given that I'm the editor of the Australian Journal of Adult Learning, but I want you to know where you can actually find this wonderful document. So thank you, Annette, and the speakers for the opportunity to launch this fantastic overview of the adult community education sector in Australia.
Thanks very much, Trace. And I definitely agree that it's an extraordinary resource for all of us, and I would encourage everybody to link and have a look at it. I'm not sure. I think we've got something up on the screen there, and you can't see me, but that doesn't matter. So I think that we've had the most action-packed and 90 minutes. In fact, we're a little over 90 minutes. So I hope that you've enjoyed what the webinar has provided for you in terms of great speakers and some incredibly important and inspirational, heartfelt and challenging ideas that we've listened to and contributed today. I want to thank Professor Tony Dreyes for his inspiring presentation, for Josephine Boffa, Luke Treadwell and Professor Sue Shaw for also their comprehensive and incredibly important reflections from their own context. I would like to also thank all of those people that sit behind a webinar like this and make it happen. And it's quite a lot of work involved. But I certainly think that it's been well worth it. And I would encourage you to tweet and get on social media if you enjoyed this, but also to let us know whether you're interested in more of these types of presentations, perhaps something like a seminar series. And I would say to you, thank you, and have an enjoyable rest of Friday and enjoy the weekend. Good afternoon.